Mais de 40 pessoas invadiram a academia de Alcochete. Um ataque aos jogadores e equipa técnica do Sporting planeado ao mais detalhado e macabro pormenor. O plano foi traçado por telefone, via WhatsApp, em 3 grupos diferentes identificados pelo
Mobile phone footage captures 50 hooded individuals in the Portuguese town of Alcochete, who broke into Sporting Lisbon's training complex on Tuesday before attacking players and coaching staff. The intruders, believed to be Sporting supporters armed with sticks and belts, reportedly caught players by surprise in their changing rooms. Players such as Patricio, William Carvalho and coach Jorge Jesus were among the targets.
Today marks 5 years of the attacks that took place at Sporting Training Academy, Alcochete, on the 15th of May 2018. Over 50 masked hooligans and self-proclaimed fans stormed the training centre, attacking players and staff, including Dost, Patricio and manager Jorge Jesus. And while most of the information regarding the attacks is pretty well known, I'm going to take you through more information, less known facts, and also the reactions of Sporting fans, including my podcast members at Sporting 160EN, as well as some other Sporting fans, and even some rival fans and non-biased journalists.
But as always, with anything, we have to start from the beginning. Sporting had just come off a disappointing 16-17 season, finishing third behind Porto and champions Benfica. But Sporting looked ready for the new season, with some new firepower in the form of transfers. Bruno Fernandes was signed from Sampdoria, Jeremy Mathieu was signed from Barcelona, Marcos Acuna was signed from Racing Club in Argentina, and Fabio Coentrão was bought on loan from Real Madrid. And those new signings joined established regulars like European champion winners William Carvalho and Rui Patricio, as well as El Patron Sebastian Coates and the big Dutchman, Dost. Not to mention, they had stunning youngsters coming from Alcochete, such as Gelson Martins, Daniel Podence and Rafael Leao. In addition, Sporting didn't lose anyone that important on the outgoing side of things that summer. Adrian was sold to Leicester for 20 million euros, Ruben was sold to Villarreal for 14 million euros, and they were the only 2 outgoings worth of note. And Os Leões were still managed by one of the best and most successful managers in Portuguese football history, Jorge Jesus.
And all of this was overseen by Sporting president Bruno de Carvalho, who was known to be an outspoken man, full of charisma and a natural born leader. The English press compared him to Donald Trump, but Bruno de Carvalho won the hearts of Sporting fans with his no-nonsense attitude, his constant communication with fans through social media, and love for the club in general.
If you want to hear more about Bruno de Carvalho, make sure to check out our career retrospective of him on our YouTube channel, which describes the highs and lows of his presidency. In our first non-Sporting fan section, I spoke to Zach Lowy, who is the founder and creator of Breaking the Lines, about Bruno de Carvalho, and he gave his thoughts on him. Zach, when I talk about Bruno de Carvalho, obviously a very, very polarising figure, was compared to Donald Trump of the footballing world by The Independent. What were your thoughts on him at the time, and what are your thoughts on him 5 years after the fact?
Yeah, I think that's a valid comparison with regards to my former president. I think that, similarly, he is somewhat of a populist, someone who definitely riles up people, and I think definitely used some violent, inflammatory language in the months leading up to this horrific attack with regards to opponents, referees, media, and I think that what that does is it definitely breeds an extremist mindset, leading some fans to believe that they need to take matters into their own hands and, definitely cross the boundaries and attack players. Something that frankly was it was horrific.
So we've introduced you to all our main protagonists of this story, but to recap, we have an outspoken but true Sporting history and president Bruno de Carvalho, a squad of talented players and a successful manager on George Jesus, but there's one other entity we've not brought in yet, the fans. The first Sporting fan I interviewed was Richard Neves, one of my co-hosts from Sporting 160 EN, where I asked him, when I say the date, the 15th of May 2018, what comes to mind?
That's Alcochete. It's probably the one of, if not the darkest, dumbest days in the history of the club. I mean, you look at it, the ramifications 5 years on are still being felt.
Sporting fans are some of the most loyal fans in football. Up until recently, they had to wait 19 years for a league title. But as we're talking about the 17-18 season, Sporting were in a 16-year title drought at the time. That never stopped the fans from going to the stadiums and cheering on the club. From the 15-16 season, all the way up until the 17-18 season, Sporting averaged around 41,000 fans at the Stadio José Alvalade, of a total capacity of 50,000 seats. In this period, Sporting fans' hearts have been broken many times. Just recently, in the 15-16 season, Sporting lost the league title to Benfica by 2 points, which also led President Bruno de Carvalho to claim that Benfica had been involved with the corruption of referees, as there was evidence of Benfica officials giving referees Benfica shirts with Eusebio's name on the back, as well as other gifts during that season. And of course, with the casual Sporting fans, there is also Sporting ultra groups, and these groups are split into 3 groups/clash. The Jubileo group, the Derivativo, and the Torcida Brigada. These fans travel home and away, spending obscene amounts of money to follow the club not just over Portugal, but Europe as well. It also should be noted, President Bruno de Carvalho was once a member of the Jubileo at a very young age. So there we have our final character, the fans. And in this clip, I spoke to my good friend Kevin, whose link you can find in the description or on the video. And Kevin, if I were to ask you about the fans, obviously we won't call them fans because they were more thugs, but they were linked to the Jubileo group. What were your opinion at the time of the fans, even before the attack, and has it changed since, with the Ultras since that day?
I've always had major respect for the Ultras groups just because of the atmosphere they always brought into the stadium. The fact that despite whatever deal behind closed doors were made between these groups and for officials at the club, because they are made, and obviously there are little cuts. It is a business at the end of the day without it being profitable in some sort of way, even if that investment then does go back into the groups. It has to be respected, their commitment to go all over the country and show their love and support for the team. And without them, the situation inside the stadiums would be much worse than it currently is. Back then, I think we could rival any atmosphere in Europe, and as with any fan base, you do get the odd exceptions, and unfortunately these odd exceptions, it's difficult to judge a whole group based on a few individuals' actions, but it's what usually you focus on the negative more than the positive, and at that point you can't really defend the actions of these individuals, and they are linked to that group at the end of the day. So they suffered a massive hit today to their reputation, being Juventude Leonina, the Ultras group, the oldest in Portugal. It's difficult to recover from it, but I've always maintained the same opinion about the Ultras groups. They have their place in football. They obviously have their very major faults. They're obviously very hard to control. They obviously have their own egos and their own opinions, and they're not perfect fans in the view of the clubs or major authorities, because they are, as they like to call themselves, uncontrollable ultras living that kind of lifestyle and reputation. But in ideal circumstances, they have to be in a football stadium and part of a club, a European club.
Let's fast forward to the 31st of January. Sporting are an unbeaten team in the league, not losing in 20 games, although drawing a few games to Vitória de Setúbal, Benfica, Braga, Porto and Podence. And on the 27th of January 2018, Sporting won the Taça da Liga, beating Vitória Setúbal on penalties on the final, but also beating Porto in the semi-finals on penalties as well. It was Sporting's only silverware that season, but you could have been mistaken in thinking they could have done that and also won the league. And in the Champions League, Sporting were dealt a hard group. They had Barcelona, Juventus and Olympiacos, but Sporting finished in third with 7 points, including a great result against Juventus at home and beating Olympiacos twice, which meant they were into the next round of the Europa League due to the rules of finishing third in the Champions League table. And Sporting had a favourable Europa League draw in the round of 32, drawing Astana from Kazakhstan. Sporting further bolstered their team in the winter transfer window. They signed Wendell from Fluminense, despite interest from Paris Saint-Germain and Liverpool. They also brought in defensive midfielder Josep Misic. Lemore was a left back brought in from Portimonense. Ruben Ribeiro was brought in from Rio Ave. And finally, Sporting welcomed back a fan favourite in the form of Super Freddy Montero from his short stay in the Chinese Super League. I took Danny Saldana, a fellow podcast member at Sporting 160yen, back to January 31st, 2018 to hear his thoughts on how the season might have unfolded. And if we were to rewind and put yourself back on January 31st, 2018, Sporting had won the Taça da Liga. We were unbeaten in 20 in the league. We had just got qualified to the Europa League after dropping out of a very hard Champions League group, but still going toe-to-toe with giants like Barcelona and Juventus.
Yeah.
What were your thoughts for that season, your expectations? Obviously, no one could predict that was going to happen. But when we rewind back to there, what were you thinking at the time as well? The transfer windows happened. We brought in players like Bruno Fernandes, Mathieu. In the winter transfer window, we brought in Wendell, who was linked to PSG and Liverpool, decided to come to Sporting. And also bringing back like fan favourites like Freddy Montero. What were your overall expectations at that point in the season?
Yeah, I mean, I thought we were going to be thereabout. For a club like ours, it's we'll take a title challenge. We're not extra demanding, especially from the drought that we were in for decades before winning the league recently. Around that time, I'm just looking it up here, we were about 2 points off from Porto, so definitely going for that title. I remember, like you were saying, the players that we brought in, it was to secure the title or at least make a real push towards the end. Freddy Montero to try to guarantee goals. We had Jorge Jesus, who was an expert in terms of the Portuguese league and winning it. Or doing really well, because not only he won it with Benfica, but his stints at Braga and everything like that, he challenged for the league there. Jorge Jesus is probably the best manager to ever coach in the Portuguese league, probably statistically. But yes, we were definitely optimistic. Like you said, performances against Barca, we went eye to eye with probably the best team in the world at that point. And also a really strong Juve team. I don't think Juve's been that near that good since then. They were so good they enticed Ronaldo to come to them, right? So it was looking like a great season, like a memorable season, and then us finally getting, I believe that was our first Taça da Liga title as well. We finally got over that hurdle, so everything was on the up, right? We looked like a club. We looked like we were back again, at least, and that if it wasn't this year, if it wasn't that year, it would have been the next year that we would have won the league, maybe. Bruno was really coming into his own. Dost is still scoring goals for us. It just all went wrong. It all went wrong. But I do remember, like, the last few games of the year, we did draw against Benfica, and I think Benfica were dropping points, if I'm not mistaken. And it was only 2 teams would qualify for the Champions League at that point. We didn't have that third spot like we currently do, but we've just lost. But I had the expectation, I think we all had the expectation that we would make Champions League ahead of our rivals. And, for that to come crashing down, I get it. I get how upset the fans were, but obviously a lot of bit of an overreaction. So, yeah.
It didn't take long before the cracks in Sporting's foundation began to show. Sporting suffered their first league loss to Estoril on the 4th of February, losing 2-0. The next game, in the Taça de Portugal, on the 7th of February, Sporting lost against Porto, losing 1-0. On the 22nd of February, Sporting drew 3-3 to Astana, but went through on aggregate 6-4. Another loss followed a month later to Porto on the 2nd of March, losing 2-1. On the 16th of March, Sporting suffered a 2-1 loss to Victoria out in Czech Republic, but again went through an extra time on aggregate thanks to a winner from Rodrigo Bataglia. And on the 31st of March, Sporting lost 1-0 to SC Braga. Sporting's eventual downfall can be pinpointed to two games in particular, and those are the quarter-final games in the Europa League against Atletico Madrid. Atletico Madrid were one of the European powerhouses, and it was going to be a tough game for Sporting, especially considering how up and down the form was at the time. Sporting would lose the first leg, 2-0, with goals from Koke, who scored in 30 seconds, and Antoine Griezmann, who, to make matters worse, would celebrate with the Fortnite L dance. And ladies and gentlemen, you need to fasten your seatbelts now, because this is where the drama begins. Bruno de Carvalho shared his dissatisfaction about Sporting's display in the game against Atletico Madrid on a post on Facebook, naming Jeremy Mathieu and Sebastian Coates as scapegoats and accusing Fabio Coentrão and Dost of not wanting to play the second game after they both received yellow cards that kept them suspended for the return leg. Following this, there was media reports of Sporting players refusing to train, something Sporting denied in an official statement. Then, shortly after, 18 of the players turned to Instagram and Facebook, all sharing the same message, making their displeasure over Bruno de Carvalho's Facebook posts publicly known. Sporting President Bruno de Carvalho then answered the players with another Facebook post, lamenting his players as spoiled kids and suspending all of the 18 players that shared a critical post about him until further notice. The only regular starter that remained unsuspended was Dost, as he didn't have a public Instagram or Facebook account, but a few days later he was suspended as well, as he agreed and backed the rest of his players. And of course, the media picked up this story and ran with it. They spread some misinformation about Sporting players refusing to train, even though the training session had already taken place. And of course, they were just trying to get headlines at this point, so they were making up things and also taking things out of context. While, fair enough, the situation was awful and it was not a great look for Sporting, the media ran with it and they tried to make as much money possible off Bruno de Carvalho and the events at Sporting. I spoke to Chris on how much the media had a part to play in the Alcochete attacks.
Do you think the media, and by the media I mean like journalists and newspaper sort of sites, had a big part to play in the Alcochete attacks?
I think that they had a big part in like maximalizing and sensationalizing and ensuring that like a narrative was set, because I mean, let's be honest, the media at that time was very against Bruno Carvalho, and this was used as like, I mean, to be fair, he put a lot of pressure on himself and he did stoke some divisions, and he was clearly like in a kind of a war with the players a bit for the last month or two. So like he was clearly at odds there. The players were starting to rebel a little bit. If you remember the post that they all did in unison when they all celebrated together, I believe it was against Pass Ferreira. So like there was, some, disconnection there, you could say. But like the media really, I mean, ultimately it was found out years later, right? Like a lot of the people, Mustafa, Bruno Carvalho, these moral authors, these organizers were really not the organizers. It was not a grand conspiracy. It was literally just pissed off dudes in their little subsection of a clock, not even a greater representation of the clock, like literally a tiny portion, 50 people out of a clock of thousands of people, just taking upon themselves, not at the direction of the leader of the clock, to just do, I guess, what they felt was right. And there was, if you recall, there were some like 16-year-olds, kids amongst them, just idiots, right? To be probably convinced, not thinking it through, thinking they're going to be badasses. And obviously, I'm not trying to defend their actions, but the media really pushed it to a level that I mean, similar things have happened at other clubs, and it's never covered the same way. Like, it was really a unique time. Like, someone could take out like a media studies master's degree, and like their whole thesis could be focused like solely on this incident. And I'd love to read it, because it was really a crazy time. It swayed public opinion. I think that's why the vote for the destitution of Bruno Carvalho. I think the media played a big role in that, because not all the facts were known at the time, and the way that it was presented, I think, led to a certain outcome.
The next few days were a roller coaster, and the media reported anything and everything they could. Firstly, Abola claimed that Sporting had ended Fabio Coentrão's loan and they would return to Real Madrid after reports of a punch to Bruno de Carvalho, and also Ojogo claimed that Sporting would field their B team for the next game against Paços de Ferreira. None of these were true. Abola also claimed Jorge Jesus, who was backing his players and hoping for a quick solution, had no intention of playing the game against Paços de Ferreira with the B team, and if that were to happen, the Sporting manager would consider going to the board and asking to be released immediately. The following afternoon, Sporting President Bruno de Carvalho and his players sat down at the Alvalade. Jorge Jesus worked very hard as an intermediator to get the party to resolve the issue ahead of the game against Paços de Ferreira. However, Bruno de Carvalho and the Sporting players reached an agreement for that time. The president lifted the suspension and the players went back to training, ready for the game against Paços de Ferreira. However, Record reported that there was no apology issued between either side, between Bruno de Carvalho and the Sporting players. The players were back in training, but the tension at the club was still very high. This newfound agreement did not stop Bruno de Carvalho returning to Facebook, confirming the disciplinary proceedings against his players for, and I quote, tarnishing the good name of the president and the club, end quote. He said they would be maintained, but suspending them wasn't a suitable punishment. Bruno continued, and I quote, the president, and that was how he referred to himself, came to the conclusion that the suspension imposed on the players wouldn't have any punishment, but only serve as an excuse for them to not fulfill their duties and get paid anyway. He continued, quote, the president doesn't act as he wants and how he wants. The only thing that drives him, and always will be, the protection of the superior interests of Sporting and to honour the trust of the members that elected him. Bruno continued, at the meeting, two things became clear. One, the manager's loyalty to the president, and two, the players behind the rebellion were the players that have demanded to leave the club for years. Now that last statement might not seem that much, but the only players who had been at Sporting for more than 2 years were Rui Patricio, who was the captain, William Carvalho, the vice-captain, Gelson Martins, Sebastian Coates, and Brian Ruiz, throwing the captains and key players under the bus, and that was an hour before kickoff. For the last interview from my podcast co-host, I spoke to my good friend and fellow co-founder of Sporting 160EN, Steph Teixeira, also known as El Patrão, about Bruno de Carvalho's use of social media at that time and whether Steph agreed with it or not. Steph, when we talk about the lead up to Alcochete and Bruno de Carvalho's Facebook post after the first leg of the Atletico Madrid game, what do you remember about that day and what were your thoughts at the time of Bruno de Carvalho talking to the team like that on a site like Facebook?
When you held at a higher standard, in the position he was as the president of the club, it's not expected for him to post such content. That's more for us fans to do, not a president of a big club. I get it why you did it, but you have to be rational. You have to use common sense when you hold that position in a club. You could have delegated somebody else to do it for him, but he exposed himself for attacks, and it wasn't called for. I agreed. I know I'm going to sound a little bit biased, but I agree with the post, but it shouldn't have come from him. It could have come from fans or somebody else, but not from him, because he's the president. He has to keep the composure of the club and the entire organization.
To say the game against Paços was emotional was an understatement. The players were applauded, Jorge Jesus cried, and Bruno de Carvalho was whistled and verbally abused. After the 2-0 win, the players and JJ applauded the crowd, and Carvalho struggled to get off his bench, where he sits during the games due to a back injury, was still whistled and held abuse at. When Sporting scored the first goal, every single player went up and celebrated. In the post-game press conference, Jorge Jesus said, "It hasn't been easy. I've been through a lot, but never something like this. I had to realise I had to defend the club. That's what I did. I've always been by my players' sides. And he said, only if there were police inside the field to stop me, I would always play the best team against Paços. And that's what I told the players. From a good response to a not so good response. Bruno de Carvalho was not happy being whistled and abused at the Sporting game, saying, and I quote, "The abuse is unacceptable, but people are free to express themselves however they like. They can be ungrateful. Foolishness is like music to me. I will never resign as Sporting president." President of Sporting's General Assembly, Jamie Marta Suarez, said he'll summon a meeting if Bruno de Carvalho doesn't resign. He said, and I quote, "The fans gave a clear message at last night's game. With Bruno, there's no peace. The chances of him staying on as president, there is none." Not only were things bad on the footballing side, but on the financial side, the price on Sporting shares had dropped over 30% during those last few days. Holdimo, who was Sporting's biggest shareholder at the time, wanted to dismiss Bruno de Carvalho as president. He also targeted Sporting great and Portugal legend Luis Figo as one of the candidates to replace him as new Sporting president. Backed into a corner with his job on the line, Bruno de Carvalho only had one thing left to do. Sporting officially withdrew all disciplinary action against their players, although they followed up with, "The Sporting board found the players' attitude incorrect." Sporting couldn't quite overturn the deficit at Atletico Madrid. However, they did win the game 1-0 with a goal from Freddy Montero, and they were close to getting a second, but it was not to be, as Sporting went crashing out in the Europa League in the quarterfinals. Jorge Jesus was already looking to the future. He wanted to stay at Sporting, and he knew it would be difficult to keep Rui Patricio and William Carvalho at the club that summer, but he wanted to also keep Gelson Martins and Bruno Fernandes. If Rui Patricio and William Carvalho were to stay at Sporting for another season, they would have been stripped of their captain duties. That comes after recent controversies, and that was said by Abola. Abola also claimed Bruno de Carvalho and Jorge Jesus met to discuss the upcoming season. They spent 30 minutes discussing football and 4.5 hours talking about the recent controversies, where Jorge Jesus asked Sporting president to stop sending text messages to the squad. Jorge Jesus said in an interview, "The meeting was to create unity so that the players, manager and president could stand together. Sporting needs peace and quiet. My future, I have another year left on my deal, which I will fulfill." And to be fair, on the footballing pitch, there was no need to worry. After the game against Paços, Sporting beat Belenenses 4-3, beat Boavista 1-0 and beat Portimonense 2-1. Things came to a head on a financial important derby. Financial differences between second, which was the Champions League, and third, Europa League, for Benfica were 42.5 million versus 3 million. For Sporting, second in the UCL and third in the Europa League, Sporting would get 27 million versus 3 million. Jorge Jesus said in a press conference, "Of course reaching second place is very important because of the money. Sporting have a financial disadvantage compared to our two big rivals. The second place gives us bigger financial guarantees." And this was the last home game at the Alvalade that season. But it also turned out to be the last game at the Alvalade for Rui Patricio, William Carvalho, Fabio Coentrão, Brian Ruiz and Gelson Martins. On match day 33, Benfica had 77 points and Sporting had 77 points. Sporting needed to win, as a draw would be a great result for Benfica. Benfica was separated by Sporting by 17 goal difference, so anything other than a Sporting win would see Sporting's hopes of being into the Champions League and the extra financial capabilities that came with it disappear. Unfortunately, they could not get the result. It was a bore 0-0 draw. Sporting blew their chance to take over Benfica. Benfica's next game, the last game of the season, was a home game against Moreirense. Sporting's last game was a very difficult away trip to Marítimo. But before we get into the games, let's talk about what happened beforehand. The Sporting fans were very obviously unhappy with the result against Benfica. Sporting arguably just missed out on 30 million plus, and obviously there was still a game to play, but it looked very unlikely that Benfica would lose to Moreirense. There were insults to the players at the games, on social media, and a lot of the fans criticised the Sporting team of having a lack of attitude and respect for the Sporting badge. But things were about to get worse. Not only did Benfica beat Moreirense, Sporting actually lost to Marítimo 2-1 with two frangos, which in English translates to basically goalkeeper mistakes by Rui Patricio, and Sporting dominated most of the game but couldn't finish their chances. But as I mentioned, most of the flack went to Rui Patricio after those two mistakes cost Sporting. Not that it would make any difference, but it just summed up how poor Sporting's season was. Right at the beginning of the game, Sporting fans held up a large banner that read "Attitude" in capital letters, which was a message to the Sporting players. The atmosphere had long been one of separation and even animosity between the fans and some players in the squad, especially captains William Carvalho and Rui Patricio. The only thing that could make it worse was a defeat to Maritimo. At the end of the match, it was Captain Rui Patricio who gathered his other teammates and urged them to go to the stands to thank the supporters for being at the stadium, which was usual at the end of the games. But realising he was being insulted and abused, Patricio backed off and refused to acknowledge the fans, and the rest of the squad did the same. A few dozen Sporting fans were waiting by the bus that the players would leave in to shout some more abuse at them and let the players know of their dissatisfaction. And it was very necessary that the police had to reinforce outside the stadium due to threats of violence towards the players. Almost everyone was rushed onto the bus, with William Carvalho being the one exception, who slowed down to listen to the fans and try and talk it out. Everything would get complicated at the Cristiano Ronaldo airport, which is located in Madeira. Whilst waiting to board the plane, the players were approached by Fernandes, former leader of the Juventus, who spoke for a few minutes with William Carvalho and Jorge Jesus. The situation deteriorated when Rodrigo Battaglia and Rui Patricio arrived. Some insults were heard in that direction, and Fernandes would be removed from the scene by the police. Despite the confusion that ensued, almost all players remained calm, with the exception being Marcos Acuna, who was visibly irritated by the situation, being pushed into the plane by Petrovic and Ruben Ribeiro. The rumoured reason to why Acuna got so upset was that Fernando Mendes, as mentioned, previous leader of the Juventus, said to him, "I will see you on Tuesday, bro," in Alcochete. Although that was the last league game, Sporting had one more big game to play, and that was the final of the Taça de Portugal. They would face newly promoted team Aves, who in an underdog story made it all the way to the final. Although Aves played good football, Sporting was still expected to win, well, up until what happened next. Just a few days later, on May 15th, 2018, just a few days after Sporting missed out on the next season's Champions League, and 5 days before they will be playing Aves in the cup final, 50 so-called fans invaded the training complex and physically attacked players and technical staff. While manager Jorge Jesus was the first to be attacked, the fans left Sporting top scorer Dost with visible wounds to his head and his foot. The Dutch striker at that time had scored 34 goals for Sporting that season. The staff didn't manage to prevent the 50 masked men from entering Sporting's locker room, where they attacked Freddy Montero, William Carvalho and Marcos Acuna, as well as Josep Misic, with belts, sticks and punches. In this video from Sporting's dressing room after the attack, which I'm muting due to copyright reasons, you can hear Bruno Fernandes say to his teammates, "It's a pleasure working with you all." Bruno Carvalho would later come out in a press conference saying what happened in Alcochete was a public crime and guarantee the club would investigate internally what happened, so that episode does not happen again. It was an absolutely horrible day and one that every Sporting fan around the world will remember. I spoke to all of my colleagues that I interviewed, asked them what they thought of the day 15th of May 2018 and what it meant to them. Richard, so Chris, so Danny, so Zach, Kevin, so Steph, what does the 15th of May 2018 mean to you?
Images of Dost being cut up, you know, some of the players like Bruno Fernandes saying how, all right, guys, it's nice playing with you, take care, sort of thing.
For me, I guess that day was just kind of like the culmination of tension that was clearly building. Like, it didn't just happen in a vacuum. It didn't just happen out of nowhere. Like, for probably about 3 months, like if you could put yourself back in that time, if you remember, or if you don't remember and you're not familiar with it, like probably starting in like March, February through like April, May, the tension was building between the players and the direção. And I mean, obviously, no one could really predict that it was going to boil over like that. If you remember, after the game in Madeira, there was the confrontation at the airport. So like tensions were high.
You felt it was coming almost, but you never thought it would really happen because there had already been some threats in, you know, car parks and airports and stuff prior to this happening. There have been very, in my opinion, unnecessary public remarks and slander from the president at the time. You felt like just everything that was going wrong that last month and a half, 2 months of the season, anything that could go wrong was going wrong. So when it happened, it was like still surprised, but like I get it because some football fans always take things too far.
Yeah, I think it means one of the darkest moments in recent Portuguese football history when a group of fans attacked a group of players in Sporting, one of the biggest clubs in Portugal, something that is frankly unacceptable and that led to the resignations of several players, some of which would return, such as Bruno Fernandes. But yeah, overall, one of the darkest days in recent Portuguese football history.
And I see the pictures of Dost with that massive lash on his head. Actually not knowing when it would stop, who else would leave, what sponsor would try and get out of a deal with the club. And honestly, if the club weren't going to suffer even worse repercussions that they did.
I never thought it could happen in a civilized country like Portugal, in a top-notch club like Sporting Portugal. I was very surprised and disgusted by the events that took place that day. And I was highly disappointed with those fans. It should have never happened. That's my take on it of that day.
I feel like where we were at the club, we were progressing, even with this minor hiccup. We were still progressing as a club, and we were starting to reach heights that we hadn't reached in at least like a decade or two, right? So it definitely took us back a few years, and I mean, I think we're still only recovering now from the attack of Alcochete. But yeah, May 15th was a tough day.
It's sad. I feel bad. Like I still feel for the players. I understand that I'm on two sides, but where I get people being upset at them for how some of them left and terminating contracts and everything. I also invite anyone to go get beat up at your place of work and tell me that you'd be okay going back into work like nothing happened.
And it was in a period where the club was already as unstable as anyone had ever saw it, and it looked like there was a point of no return, honestly, in the midst of it, whilst major key figures were coming out and either resigning or putting statements, all ruining the reputation of the club.
In times of darkness, the true Sporting fans showed some light. More than 500 Sporting fans gathered outside the Alvalade that same night to display their disgust with the hooligan attack and show their support to the players, technical staff and the club. These were the proper Sporting fans and what Sporting represents. The day after, 23 hooligans were detained after the attacks on the Sporting players, and they were charged with several crimes, including kidnapping, forest fires and terrorism. In an act of insanely big courage, the Sporting players issued a statement confirming that they still wanted to play the Taça de Portugal final against Aves out of the respect for their colleagues and the good name of Portuguese football. In a time of turmoil and chaos, Sporting fans looked to their leader and their president Bruno de Carvalho to unite the club, the fans and the players. After being asked to resign by the chairman of the Sporting's General Assembly, Jaime Marta Soares, and their biggest shareholder, Álvaro Sobrinho, President Bruno de Carvalho held a press conference the day after, where he came out swinging, verbally, not physically this time, attacking everyone and everything. This press conference included quotes like, quote, "The press tried and achieved to manipulate what I said, dishonouring an honourable man," end quote. And also, quote, "The club is being bullied and terrorised by the press, politicians and Sporting members," end quote. Bruno de Carvalho went on an hour-and-a-half long rant, but you can read this transcript below. Feel free to pause it and read the whole thing. The Sporting president also stressed that the players weren't at fault, but indirectly giving them, especially Rui Patricio, responsibility for being attacked by their own fans. Sporting would then face Aves in the final of the Taça de Portugal that Sunday, where Dost entered the field with a bandage on his head from the attacks obviously having the laceration on his head. And things, unfortunately, did not improve for the Sporting side. They lost 2-0 from another frango from Patricio, and also Dost pretty much missed an open goal. It was a sad end to a sad season, but also a poetic end to that season too. Freddy Montero would score the only goal for Sporting as they lost 2-1, losing to Aves in the final and giving Aves their first trophy ever. As a neutral, it was a beautiful scene. Aves from the north lifted their first ever Portuguese Cup trophy and brought it back home to the humble village de Aves, with less than 10,000 inhabitants. And as a quick side note, at the age of 42, former Portuguese international Kim didn't only become the oldest player to ever play in the Portuguese Cup, but he also came the oldest to win it. Rui Patricio was in tears, Jorge Jesus looked demotivated, and the whole squad just seemed completely out of it. To recap the horrendous week, Sunday, they lost out on next season's Champions League after losing to Maritimo. Tuesday, they were attacked by 50 masked fans at their own training complex, leaving several players physically and mentally injured. And then the following Sunday, they lost the Portuguese Cup final to Aves. Jorge Jesus said in the post-game press conference, quote, "It's been a very complicated week, starting with what looked like a horror movie. I want to thank my players for their professionalism of even playing the final." Sporting also announced that they had cut ties with Juve while they were under investigation for the attack on the Sporting players and staff. Sporting also announced they had heavily increased the security of their training complex. A little late now, lads. 2 weeks later, Sporting President Bruno de Carvalho confirmed that Rui Patricio, who was a Sporting captain and also a Sporting legend, requested to get his contract terminated. Sporting President Bruno de Carvalho confirmed he stopped Rui Patricio's 18 million move to Wolverhampton last night, after the deal was all signed. He said, "Of the 18 million euros, Jorge Mendes wanted 7 million of them, so I had to stop it. Unhappy with the decision, Rui Patricio felt he had no choice but to rescind his contract." Bruno de Carvalho would say, "Sporting don't give in to blackmail. Rui Patricio is being manipulated by his agents." He would further say, "My doors will always be open for talks. Business, yes, but not blackmail. I don't think Rui wanted to bring that upon him after the club that helped him grow. I hope Rui can leave through the big door, just like he and the club deserves." 2 days after announcing that he terminated his contract with Sporting, Daniel Podence also followed in his footsteps and informed the club he will also terminate his contract after 13 years at Sporting. Just after a week, William Carvalho, Gelson Martins and Bruno Fernandes all followed their captain's lead and terminated their contracts, quoting "just cause." You can see the termination letters here. Feel free to pause and read through them. What's interesting was most of these players had offers to go elsewhere. As we mentioned, Rui Patricio had his deal to Wolves cancelled, Gelson Martins had his move to Arsenal cancelled after Arsenal put in a €30 million offer, which was turned down by Bruno de Carvalho. 1 day later, Sporting's top scorer in the last 2 seasons, Dost, who has scored 61 goals in as many Liga games since arriving in 2016, became the 6th player to terminate his contract with Sporting. The Dutchman was one of the most harmed during the fans' attack at the Sporting training complex. Bruno Fernandes would share a quote to Record, saying, quote, "The loss of control was such that I felt I would not escape alive from the Sporting fans' attack. To this day I wake up at night, in fright, with the image of the terror that I had to relive, and I can't imagine going back." Bruno Fernandes also had some harsh words for Bruno de Carvalho, saying the following: "On the eve of the cup final, which Sporting ended up losing to Aves, instead of trying to cheer up his players, he decided to talk about himself, painting out like he was the victim and blaming the players for what happened in the training complex." He also said, "It seemed like he was enjoying it. He called it a boring situation." Things looked like they were about to get even worse when Benfica president Luis Felipe Vieira confirmed he tried to sign the Sporting players that ended their deals. He's quoted as saying, "This year I'm going to do something crazy. Sporting played us 25 years ago when they signed 2 Benfica players after they terminated their deals. I'm not playing anymore." Newspaper Correio da Manhã claimed Benfica had already signed a pre-agreement with Bruno Fernandes and Gelson Martins. Sporting's fierce Lisbon rivals apparently offered Bruno Fernandes a 2-year deal worth $2 million a year with a $2 million sign-on bonus. Sporting said they were going to take Benfica to court and report them to FIFA for illegally harassing and contacting Rui Patricio, who turned down their offer. Sporting tried to do the same if Benfica did contact Bruno or Gelson, which turns out they hadn't. Sporting president Bruno de Carvalho confirmed he'd resign if the players write a letter saying, firstly, that if this management quits, they will reverse their termination and play for Sporting. Secondly, if I run and get elected again, they will maintain their contracts and not try to rescind. Dost would state in his termination letter, 2 days after the fans' attack, I had to see a psychologist because I couldn't sleep. I was in a state of great anxiety and irritation. I was diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and I had great headaches for several days. On the 18th of June, Ruben, Ribeiro, Rodrigo Battaglia and Rafael Leao became the 7th, 8th and 9th player to terminate their contracts with Sporting. They joined the list of William Carvalho, Rui Patricio, Dost, Bruno Fernandes, Gelson Martins and Daniel Podence. That was a total of 9 players terminating their deals with Sporting, meaning 200 million euros in potential sales just walked out the door for free. Sporting's financial advisors believed there was a concrete threat of bankruptcy for the Lisbon side. In an official statement, Sporting announced they'll take legal action against the players that terminated their deals. They will try to hold the players and the club signing them responsible, and they'll seek compensation for the damage and the losses suffered. Sporting president Bruno de Carvalho would then say, there's only one reason they're terminating their contracts, and it's not down to what happened at the training complex or the nightmares. It's simple. It's money. The termination of the players' contracts angered the fans, especially because some of the players came through the academy at ages 12 or under and lived their whole lives at Sporting, such as Rui Patricio, William Carvalho, Daniel Podence and Rafael Leao. I spoke to Steph again and I asked him what were his thoughts on the players rescinding. And Steph, when the players rescinded their contracts, obviously key players and captains like Rui Patricio, William Carvalho, and some young prospects like Daniel Podence, and you've got Rafael Leao, to name a few others. What were your thoughts at the time? And I know the Sporting fan base was a bit split 50-50. Some thought they were like fair enough for leaving because they did get attacked at their workplace. Another percentage felt like they betrayed the club. Where did you stand and what are your thoughts and have they changed in the 5 years since?
At the time when it happened, I get it. The emotions took place in the players' way of thinking, rationale. I'm pretty sure their agents also, I don't know anything, I'm just speculating. They played the big role in telling them, hey, this is the perfect chance for us to cash in, go to a bigger club, get you a better contract without any say from Sporting, because I believe they all had amounts of money, like they're worth it 20 million or more, some of them. And the agents, they took advantage of that and they convinced the players. If the players, they convinced themselves after speaking with the families, I get it, but at the same time, I don't get it. Because we had players, foreigners like Quats, which was also part of it, and he stayed and he showed composure. And so me as a fan, I feel betrayed because the club gave you everything. Okay, you gave everything to the club too, but the way you left, we felt like betrayed. They could have stayed and endured what happened, but they decided to leave. So I felt a little bit betrayed, even though after so many years, like you said, 5 years later, some of them had the decency of working out a deal that the club still made some money. But me, on a personal basis, I felt that they should have stayed and they betrayed the club. I do understand the emotion part of it. They were attacked, but they could have done like Quats and so many other players that stayed. Even Bruno Fernandes, he almost effed up, but he realized, let me go back and stick with the club in this moment of weakness. And props for that. I know people say, oh, he stayed because they paid him more money. Whatever might be the case, but he stayed. And he still talks good about Sporting every time he has an occasion to do so. Well, that's my take on that. I wish that every single one of them stayed. Rafael Leão has a lot to do maybe with his father. I think he was influenced heavily by his father. But shame on him, because he should have stayed. He should have told his father, no, I'm going to stay, and that's it. Yeah, but that's my take on it.
We are now winding down this story. On June 21st, 2018, Bruno de Carvalho's future as Sporting president was set to be decided at next Saturday's General Assembly, after months of turmoil and controversies. There was a full civil war at Sporting. Jamie Marta Suarez and Bruno de Carvalho decided to suspend each other. Marta Suarez was the head of the SAD, which is the Sporting Public Limited Sports Company, and Bruno de Carvalho, the president of Sporting, ended up suspended each other, and they were both banned from the premises and entering under any circumstances. On the 25th of June, Bruno de Carvalho's stay as Sporting president would come to an end. 71% of almost the 15,000 members voted for the dismissal of President Bruno de Carvalho and the rest of his board. Bruno de Carvalho went onto Facebook and said, "After 5 years at the club, it's all been a waste. I will no longer be a Sporting fan." 2 hours later, however, Bruno de Carvalho made another Facebook statement claiming he's still president and that he'll contest the votes and run for re-election. On the same day, yes, this is all in one day, Bruno de Carvalho changed his Facebook statement, apologising for his human side and the insults, claiming he won't contest the vote that saw him being dismissed, but still insisted in rerunning for presidency. Sporting hired Sousa Sintra as interim president, and he wanted to reunite the family. The Portuguese press claimed the players who terminated their deals have agreed to talk to Sporting and their new management after dismissal of Bruno de Carvalho. And in some cases, that's what happened. Bruno Fernandes returned to the club. Although there were rumours of him earning more money or asking for anything, he simply did not. He came back on the same contract and was given the captaincy of Sporting for returning. Dost also made a sensational return to Sporting. However, his one was a bit different, as Sousa Sintra offered him an eye-watering €100,000 per week deal to return as a Sporting player. Rodrigo Battaglia also returned to Sporting after terminating his contract, again given a huge pay rise by Sousa Sintra. Jorge Jesus also left his post at Sporting, joining Al Hilal out in Saudi Arabia. There was now a race to become new Sporting president. Pedro Madeira Rodriguez, who ran against Bruno de Carvalho twice and lost, said he'd bring in Claudio Ranieri if he won the Sporting presidential election on September 8th. Bruno de Carvalho did try to rerun for elections, but was expelled as a socio and a member, so unable to rerun. João Benedito, one of 9 Sporting president candidates for the upcoming election, said he'd hire league winners Peter Schmeichel and Andre Cruz if he won. The Dane would be the club's new head of international relations, and the Brazilian would be the new director of football. In the end, there was only one winner on September 8th for the new president of Sporting. Although João Benedito won the most popular vote, just like in America, Frederico Fernandes actually ended up winning the presidential election. Fernandes, who was actually head of Sporting's medical department at the time of the attacks, was now the president of Sporting, taking over a mess that he had to try and fix. We are now at the end of the story. However, I asked our interviewees one more question.
Yeah, and Steph, if you were to blame just one entity, if I give you one option to blame, it could be anyone that was involved or anything like that, who do you think is responsible for the attacks on the Alcochete Academy?
That's a tough question because there's so many factors at play.
Yeah, it's tough because I think there's a lot of moving parts.
I think I would have to go with the fans who attacked the players, and some of whom I believe served jail time. I don't really know what the legal ramifications were for them long term, but I think that I would definitely go with the fans who attacked them.
Apart from the individuals themselves, I can only go with how the media seem to exaggerate the situation tenfold.
So I honestly, I blame the individual members. I guess in a roundabout way, you could try to argue perhaps Bruno Carvalho made the tension hot, and then as a result of the tension being hot, it spurred these people into action. But I just don't think that that's necessarily how things work, right? People can provoke, people can be passionate. I don't think that makes people do crazy actions necessarily, So I place the blame on the individuals who took it upon themselves to do that. But at the same time, I'm also aware that there was a lot of opportunism that was taken advantage of at the time. And honestly, our club has still not been able to heal from this moment.
I really love Bruno de Carvalho. I think he's one of the better presents we had. I think it started with him. I think coming out and attacking the team publicly on Facebook was what really started the downfall. I think having to always have the last word in the press was his downfall. I think, and I was all for him if he wants to go into the dressing room and berate the players behind closed doors. I understand that. I think doing it publicly and just maliciously like he did, unfortunately invited some people who were very loyal to him and are still very loyal to him even to this day, and are almost fanatics, took matters into their own hands because they thought, well, he's publicly slandering the team. Maybe it's up to us, the most frenetic and diehard supporters of the club, to take matters into our own hands and teach them a lesson.
I think it's simply those fans. There's no one to blame. I mean, we could say, the lack of security, but at the time, the security, heavier security wasn't warranted. And that's why we only have maybe one guy in those CCTVs, and that wasn't apparently good enough. But if I'm going to blame somebody, it's those fans. We have to learn how to win games and lose games. It's part of sports. We win some, we lose some. It's okay to get upset. I mean, I get upset every single time Sporting loses. But, after one day, maybe 2 days, it blows over. It's just the way it is. But it never crosses my mind I'm going to insult players. I'm going to beat players because we lost. Even the best team in the whole world that loses. I mean, Manchester City is one of the best teams, and they lose once in a while. So that's it. I blame the fans. You could never take to that extreme. I don't agree with the ultras. They're too fanatic to me. Just be a fan. Support your team. Go to the stadium. Give them some incentives, but it should never cross that very fine line.
Sort of criticizing the fans, that didn't go over well, and maybe that left fans, frustrated and angry. But maybe that passion that he brought out of all of us, in his tenure as president. I think it just boiled over, and sometimes passion just leads to this, right?
Let's wrap up some loose ends from the Alcochete attacks. Bruno de Carvalho was arrested and accused of having organised the incident on May 15, 2018 at the Alcochete Training Academy. Bruno de Carvalho was arrested in November 2018 but released on bail 4 days later. He was accused of 56 crimes, including terrorism, which is known as kidnapping under Portuguese law. 2 years later, May 2020, Bruno de Carvalho was acquitted of any wrongdoing and any crimes. He said outside the courthouse, quote, "I'm innocent. They should have trusted me. I gave everything to Sporting. I often put my club ahead of my life and my family. No person deserves what I went through." End quote. A total of 44 people were accused of various crimes following the attacks. 9 of the defendants were sentenced to 5 years in prison, and 29 others were handed 5 years suspended sentences. The majority of the players who left Alcochete managed to get their clubs to pay Sporting a fee to sign that player, with the exception of one, Rafael Leão. Rafael Leão was ordered to pay Sporting a total of 16.5 million after losing an appeal over a contract dispute. Rafael Leão terminated his contract with Sporting in 2018, citing the incident which angry fans attacked own players after breaking into the club's training base. The Portuguese international would later join Lille on a free transfer, playing 1 season in French football before joining Milan in 2019. In March 2020, Leão was ordered to pay Sporting 16.5 million by the Portuguese Sport Arbitration of Court for unlawful termination. Sporting had originally requested a 45 million that should have been paid to them based on the release clause in Leal's contract. However, an independent figure deemed that a total between 15 million and 18 million would be sufficient compensation for the Portuguese club. So here we are, 5 years later after Alcochete, and we are unfortunately at the end of this video. I know this is quite a long one, but there was a lot of information to get covered, and a lot of you might not have known the full story. If you do enjoy content like this, please let me know in the comments down below, or on Twitter, at sporting160_en. Feel free to leave us your feedback, like the video, and subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Sam, thank you for watching, and peace.